Let's do this. Um, Welcome, everyone. My name is Jared Williams. I'm the co-founder and current director of Lion's Jaw Festival. Lion's Jaw is an annual experimental performance and dance festival. It's located in Boston, Massachusetts, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is unceded Nipmuc, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag territories. And that acknowledgement is so important and covers both where I'm standing now, but also the location of MIT, which is our co-producer of this year. Like many of you, we experienced great loss with the sort of pandemic, and we were really looking forward to our first time working with MIT and being able to be in this beautiful space. But they have been incredibly supportive through this process and have helped make this talk possible. And yeah, so I just wanted to thank them, and Susan Wilson will step in a second and say a few words. I also want to thank our panel. We had an amazing time last night with Eroca Nichols and Jess, and Thomas DeFrantz joins us again with zavé, martohardjono, and Joseph Pierce today. I'm super excited. So yeah, I think that's it. We're gonna have a little Q&A at the end if there's time, so feel free to put in any questions you have in the chat. I'll try to collect them. And again, I'll be posting things intermittently in the chat regarding the ASL and payment and things like that. So Susan, did you want to say a few things?
Sure, and mostly just a thank you to all of you and all of these wonderful panelists and artists that Jared and Tommy have put together. It's really a fantastic lineup, and we could not be more proud and honored to be a part of making it happen. So just keeping that as short as possible so we can maximize the time we have with everybody here. I'll pass it right around to the incomparable Tommy DeFrantz.
Thank you so much, Susan. And we thank our friends at MIT, which is a pretty amazing place, as I'm sure we all have opinions or thoughts about it. And Susan and Jay Scheib are doing important work for us to imagine spaces where queer futures can be materialized. I broadcast from Durham, North Carolina, in a space on the campus of Duke University, which is on the ancestral lands of the Shakori, the Eno, and the Catawba people. I want to start with a gesture to ground the us of me and all the ghosts who are here, and there are many, and ancestors as well. So I'll light a candle, and I will bring queer kindred into the space with me, and especially those queers who found their way to resistance as a strategy of survival. I started easy with this acknowledgement and want to offer this out to the panelists who are with us tonight. And I ask you to, I don't know, share your acknowledgement or welcome yourself, or, you know, be with us now as you will. Let us know what you're thinking in terms of how shall you prefer to be addressed by others this evening. And thank you.
Hi, I'm Joseph Pierce. I am a citizen of Cherokee Nation. So I'm glad to be connected to Tommy, who is on lands that are not too far from my people's ancestral homeland. I'm calling, or I'm zooming in now from Brooklyn. which is the ancestral homeland of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples. And I'm really glad to participate with everyone. And I'm glad to call in the ancestors to be with us today. I'm glad to be accompanied by them and all of you. I'm a professor at Stony Brook University, which is on Long Island, where I teach about Latin American literary and cultural production, queer theory, and Native American and Indigenous studies. I also am a co-curator with S.J. Norman of a performance series called Knowledge of Wounds, which centers Indigenous and queer Indigenous bodies in relation, which had its first iteration this past January at Performance Space New York. So I'd also like to bring in some of that that labor, that work, and that energy to this space as well, and SJ from Australia. So that's all. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zavé, martohardjono. I'm Zooming from my living room, which is in my home of 14 years, which is in the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy, which has one of the most incredible stakes in Black history in this country and is also on unceded Lenape Hoking. I grew up in Queens, and I'm bringing in today, certainly for this conversation and just generally right now, I'm bringing in caretakers, all my caretakers, be them my ancestors and my present caretakers, my queer kin, family, and my future caretakers. And I bring in also my identity as a caretaker. And I think that I'm trying to figure out how to identify with my artwork as a dance maker, as a performance artist. And maybe right now all of the labor is caretaking. So even in making art over the past few years, it has been so much about care, exchanges of care, so that we can labor together and work together and take care of ourselves to stay sustained into long futures of art making and shift all of that as is needed.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think we should just start there, because that's where we are. This is our presenting for now, is this idea of care and caretaking. I'm thinking of how Christina Sharp, in her In the Wake, offers up this introduction where she has this sort of repeated statement that thinking requires care. And it's so obvious, and it's something that, so many artists or experimental makers would maybe know, but not necessarily enact in relationship to other people. And that's always been a little bit of a struggle for makers, I think, in a way. And we've seen all kinds of uncaring sort of structures of company. But as we imagine queer caring and thinking requiring care, does that resonate in a real nowness of now in terms of Rona and separations and disembodied relationships now? How is care showing up now as a thinking practice and a making practice for you?
You should go first.
Okay. I have two simultaneous thoughts.
Great. Beautiful.
One is, if we took care to think, which also meant being more critical, I think, of our own thought patterns, we could collectively change the way that we think and think more together. And that is, like, for me, a kind of aspirational political act, is to take more care in our thinking, in our speech, and everything that tumbles from that. And I'm always hesitant to focus so much on thought and intellect, just because so much of our wisdom comes from our body, and that wisdom is historically erased for folks of color. You know, gut thinking, gut knowledge, gut wisdom is in the colonial paradigm below the head. And so there's this conditioning that especially assimilated folks like myself have gone through. So it's like, yes, and yeah.
And that makes me think of, I mean, we could go through the whole history of like the humors versus the rational self versus, we could go through all of that. But I think in this moment, we're seeing how care and embodiment is becoming so much more central to the way that people are thinking and enacting, precisely because it is so limited in this moment. And so the question of touch and of proximity that was described in the panel yesterday, I think also relates to care in the sense that when we care for, we are always in relation to and with, and because of that, we are necessarily reaching out and gesturing towards a type of relationality that is inherently decolonial. And because we are not singular beings, and simply by acknowledging that, we are already positioning ourselves, orienting ourselves in a way that allows for greater resilience and survivance and caretaking. And I think that I mean, it can be really simple, but it's also hard to enact because of the structural and historical limitations that have been constructed around our bodies and our communities.
There's something about bodies and time I'm thinking. So I know that when Christina Sharp writes that, as I try to work through that in my own, like in studio practice or being alongside others, this kind of care becomes manifest in some ways through expressions of time, like not just rushing in and thinking I got it, or I can help you get it now, like you'll just get it because I want you to get it, whatever the it is that needs to be gotten. But something about time that seems also in this formation that maybe we could sort of think through together a little bit. Caregiving, bodies, and then time, because time has an influence also on how we experience the possibilities of body. And where they can move and how they move and where they want to go next, if you will. What about that time in terms of care?
Yeah, my mind was going there, actually, that just thinking about what care and relationship actually require is time. And I think so much about slowing down, just slowing down, not only the way we make together, the amount of hours we spend together, slowing down the process of even identifying, okay, here I am with another person, for example, or here I am with a set of folks and we're trying to make something together. Slowing down all of the assumptions, slowing down that rapid fire, what are we here for? What do we need to do? How much time do we have? All of that. And I've been thinking also about labor, the care, labor, and I think queer caretaking also is this sort of necessarily a community experience. I mean, I think I learned big forms of caretaking in queer community as a young person, because so many folks in queer community, we have one another, and that's what we've got.
Yeah.
And the labor of caretaking for ourselves inside of caretaking for others, it's a lot of work, actually. And this moment of political collapse and genocide and violence, all kind of, climate injustice, all kind of swirling together, I think is really, for me, pulling back any whatever sheer veil there was. That, I was under no impression that we had a system of care, for us publicly, but kind of really like just knocking the last legs down on the concept that there are structures of care that look after society and look after communities. So these care structures that are just already there, that are now getting to see this shine and this light put around them, be like, oh yeah, mutual aid networks or community efforts. Like, these are things that have always been there and have been always keeping so many of us thriving and surviving. And now there's kind of an actual, maybe a mainstream attention to these cultures of care. I wonder if that's what's happening.
I mean, I think that in a way, so time is something that I could talk about forever.
Nice, well done.
I love to talk about, a phrase I learned. I mean, every sort of like racialized group has their own time. And with SJ Norman, we will talk about being on black fella time, which is like how they describe it in Australia among Aboriginal communities, Indigenous communities, and to be on Indian time. But I think that there's a way that it's not just being 15 minutes late for everything, but enacting a type of ancestral relation that is that places us in a longer tradition and history. And so we who have been here for 30,000 years know about time, and we know how to situate ourselves within the long durée of historical moments. This is why care for me in this moment actually depends very heavily on that long memory. Because when I hear people talk about the apocalypse or the breakdown of the political system, I think to what my ancestors must have thought. I think about what they survived. I think about the fact that when Cherokee people were forced to leave our traditional homelands, we brought with us the sacred fire that burned at the center of every village, every town. And so the fire was brought, the coals were brought in little moss baskets.
Yeah.
And those are the same coals that were used to start the fire again after the Trail of Tears. And that is care. That is a form of long historical care. And remembering that is so important for our communities. And so I think for me, it's like situating myself in that longer history is also a form of care because it is ancestral care. So, I mean, I think that's also, Zavé, that's kind of what you were talking about with like body memory. You know, we have these memories embedded within our sinews, and it's in recognizing and feeding those memories that we are able to, or that I am at least am able to not imagine that this is the first apocalypse that we have seen. We who have survived know this is not new. This is structural. This has been here for a long time. This is the way white people want it to be. So like, I'm not dismissing the current moment, but I do think that we have the ability to see our survival as having emerged through a much longer history of futurity, which in some cases, like is an ancestral futurity. That is the type of relationship that I'm interested in cultivating in spiritual practice, in arts practice, and in you know, the stuff that I'm writing. And this is something that's developed, you know, through talking with other Native folks, with talking with S.J. Norman, with talking with Devin Emery, talking with people who have this practice of care, but it's an ancestrality that is emergent towards the future.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, I think I'm also, something that's swirling in my mind is that body memory, which is both a place to lean on, or a place to pull from, or a place to be in, and also the ways in which I think trauma and stress is also part of our body memory. And I think definitely something I'm just feeling, you know, over the past 7 months is this experience of encountering my own, you know, physicalized stress, mental stress, and all these things, decision fatigue, and so on and so forth, and encountering that so much trauma and anxiety in so many of the people who are caretaking for me, and we're really like caring for each other and ourselves under a kind of heightened physical place. And so I've been thinking, it's kind of been dawning on me actually this week that I'm like, oh, you know what, we're kind of doing this, you know, everyday life kind of shift. We're doing it right now. This is sort of our 7th or 8th month of this particular kind of way of being with each other, and this practice of understanding uncertainty on a really daily level, and making a lot of decisions constantly around health and care and basic needs. And so, yeah, I would love to kind of touch in more, you know, with other folks on a constant or consistent basis, kind of to remember that the rattling is also a flushing back of memory from times that our ancestors have survived.
I was thinking a bit about how we talk about trauma and sort of expression, the expression of trauma that, you know, comes through experience, but also through memory, and sometimes it's experienced and expressed through a kind of physicality that might not be in the front of a consciousness. And there's this, you know, more recent work in epigenetics that's trying to help us understand, especially for people of color living under white supremacy, which would be everyone on the planet, is living under white supremacy, and then how epigenetics are trying to narrate or help us understand tendency and, again, orientation through genetic expression is in some ways kind of related to, viral transmissions. And so we're kind of in the, I'm affirming what I heard you both say, that we're in this, and we've been in this before. We were in it with HIV when we were trying to figure out new caretaking strategies across queer communities, or if they were same gender loving communities then, or still are, however they were naming themselves and each other. And yeah, and this sort of concern with illness and non-normativity, maybe we could turn towards, as we're thinking of ancestors, then are we thinking of kin? And what is kinship in this construction of a kind of ancestral possibility, and especially in terms of our queer kindred, or queer ancestors? How do we find them? How are they helping us make or survive or strategize or caretake?
Kinship is also something that I love to talk about. I think that some of my thoughts about this, one thing that I would like to say about kinship, yeah, is that it is not as normative as people often think it is. And I don't think that we need to let normative capture kinship as often as we do. In some of my earlier academic work, one of the things that I tried to show is how the normative family model is constantly breaking, fracturing from within. And this is why it has to be so closely guarded in modernity. This is why white supremacy and normative kinship go hand in hand with capitalist accumulation, because it is only in maintaining those structures that those systems are able to grow and expand and metastasize. To use a metaphor. But I think too that kinship is also a type of ethical relationship that we have with other beings that is not limited to the human. And this is something that Native communities have always known. And this is something that that I've been thinking about more recently, drawing on work by Karen Recollet in Toronto and Emily Johnson here in New York, to describe kinstellations and kinstellatory practices, which are grounded in indigenous epistemologies of relation and care. For example, if I can just tell a tiny story.
Please.
So there's a story in the Cherokee tradition of the pine tree, and the pine tree and the stars. So there were a group of boys, and all that the boys wanted to do was dance. They just loved to dance. And one of the boys always would get the others to dance, and they would dance around and around and around. And the mother thought that this wasn't exactly right because they were not doing their chores. They were dancing instead. And so one day, the boys sat down to dinner, and the mother wanted to punish them, and she gave them rocks in their dinner, in their porridge. And they ate this, and they got really mad. and they went outside to just dance. So they go outside and they dance, and they're dancing and dancing and dancing, and they start to rise, to levitate, and up towards the sky. And the mother comes out and is very afraid, and she grabs one of them, and not wanting to, but she pulls him down to the ground, and he hits the ground with so much force that the ground swallows him up. And the other boys kept on circling and rising, and they become the constellation that we know as the Pleiades. And the boy who fell to the ground became the pine tree. And so the pine tree grows up to reconnect with his brothers, the stars. And in a way, this is the type of relationship that I think we're talking about when we say kinship, when we say constellation, in which it is a yearning towards, a seeking to be with, that is not necessarily limited to the human form, but in this case, in the case of this story, it is human and tree and star. And there are other stories that we have and that other communities have that demonstrate this type of relationality. But these are the types of things that I think we need to be grounding ourselves in. And I use that word very advisedly, grounding ourselves in those stories that teach us how to reach across the breach between human and other than human, or between the material and the spiritual, or between land and sky. So that's a story that I keep on trying to think about and to keep with me. That is a story about care and about relationship building.
I think we're in the story still and imagining it, and it's the time it takes to register and process and consider and respond. We need our new colored people time in Zoom, which is okay. It's okay. And our queer time. Zavé, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm just, as you told that story, I saw the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I saw every image. I wasn't watching. I felt that I was in a forest seeing it all. And yeah, maybe circling a little back to this idea of the time that it takes to think with consideration, to act with consideration, to be in relationship with consideration. And then also I think that, I can be sometimes a very action-oriented person. So I like the idea of mobilizing community in consideration. It's bringing me back to this idea of what is when we are connected across, right, across species, with our environment, with our climate, with each other, across those breaches that you just named, the process looks really different to develop relationship. The process looks really different to be in conversation and caretake. And I've been thinking so much about that culture, actually, right? So stepping away from the understanding of the word culture as specific to ethnicity or geography, really cultures of relationship. And I think about it in terms of what kind of homes, communities, environments get to happen when we culture shift, towards care and centering collectivity. And then also, what does our art making and our creative practice look like when that same culture shift happens? what does our community organizing look like when that culture shift happens? And I think it's all there. I think it's actually all there. And it's also, I've been wondering if this is about making cultural agreements together in collective, that we have to unwind collectively the ways that we're conditioned to be in relationship. And it's actually really urgent right now. It's always been urgent, but it's really urgent because I'm seeing the bifurcation, especially of sort of political culture in North America, and then in other in other nations and other parts of the world that are experiencing fascism on this particularly acute level. Yeah. There are kinds of these multiple cultures that are very much in antagonist relationship, and so it's these belief systems and value systems and culture systems. And obviously that's zooming out a little bit too wide for any kind of, comfortable level. But I think I then, when I think really expansively about that, this global climate of fascism that we are in together globally with so many communities around the world, then I kind of am like, okay, that's time. And then me, my life, my kin, my family, my communities, people that I don't know that I care deeply for, and then try to support in any way that I can. So it's like macro and micro at the same time. And that kind of connection, I think, is really meaningful too. Not just thinking about my little world, but understanding that inherent connection to these global experiences that people I will never meet are also suffering and surviving as we are in my little corner in Brooklyn.
I think it's a super important point around the materialization of Black as an outcome of chattel slave trade, produces the idea of Black, not a Black person, but a Black as a Black, a plastic. Zakiya Jackson calls it a plasticity that's not human and not human simultaneously, here, not here. But then as sort of a global possibility of Black people responding to BLM, along with, many other people who responded to what was happening in North America in terms of the very particular fascism. And at the same time, the particular experiences in different parts of the planet are quite different. So there are people, trying to get into the system as makers, if you will. Algerians living in the south of France who are trying to get into a choreographic center, having really different sort of concerns around what they imagine as a next thing to be or do, from the kind of conversation we might have here, through Lion's Jaw in our assembly. What do we make of that? It's really, I'm trying to pose it as a question of orientation, and to face towards each other means we're, in some ways, maybe turning away from those other structures that were never made for us or serving us. What about that? Zavé, maybe you can start there if you like, but what are we turning from, and how do we connect to people who are turning towards those systems that some of us are thinking are already bankrupt?
Yeah, yes, turning away from, and then I'm also thinking opening up towards letting in, and the word remembering, Joseph, re-inviting, or allowing, all of these action verbs. I think this is a wonderful question for this moment of, so many people around me are qualifying this moment, 2020 in North America, as uncertain, a time of uncertainty. And from my meditation practice, it's like, no, there's no time that's certain, no such thing as certainty to begin with. So practicing uncertainty is actually a really important spiritual practice, and it's really, really, really like advanced, you know, when you get into those kinds of like teachings. I think the uncertainty is the part that maybe holds some of us back. I mean, my collaborators, Raha Behnam and Ube Halaya, and I were on the video the other day in our rehearsal, and we had a moment of really just taking some breaths and talking about how we're grieving the American dream that our immigrant ancestors really that had to suffer so much for us to now all be, you know, in Canada and in the US, when we're all from Southeast Asia or Iran. That's where we are from. And grieving that the American dream, not believing in any sense, right? But grieving the grief of our parents, our grandparents, who had to, you know, put so much effort and labor into believing in something that just ultimately ends up giving them nothing and us nothing. And here we are, oddly in the same place, grappling with these questions about the void of disconnection from our own communities on some transnational level, and then how do we take care of our families and ourselves when really there's nothing, you know, there's not really a social system here for immigrant folks, for so many folks. And it was like, it was this really deep emotional moment that just kind of happened unexpectedly. And so that's what's coming to mind right now, is this uncertainty, right? Like, what we may believe will get us something, clout, the spotlight, a means of survival, income, recognition. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, not sure. And certainly, definitely not less sure now.
This reminds me a little bit of the artist Demian Dene Yaze, who's Dene, and some of their graphic art and some of their poetry that talks about the American dream. And they have a performance called Shatter that they have performed recently along with Kevin Holden as part of TBA festival that's run out of Pica in Portland. And they take caricatures of indigenous faces, bodies, you know, Pocahontas, those things. And at the end of a very arduous performance, they shatter these images. And I think that's kind of what, Zavé, you're actually talking about there too, is the shattering of that image of the American dream, which was always constructed as a caricature. And so we get to this idea of what is the face and what is the caricature, or what is the mask. And I think that the realities of capitalist extraction are being laid bare in a more visible and visceral way than we have seen. And that, in conjunction with the broad swell of Black Lives Matter, both in the US and globally, I think also to Brazil, I think to France, where Black bodies are resisting the colonial interpolation that Frantz Fanon describes. And then I also, I think that there's a way that all of this defies description without the use of nouns that are also verbs. So we were talking about the doing, right? And this is why I really, I think it's important for us to be theorizing and pushing language and pushing conceptually, which may not necessarily mean only being future or forward oriented, but also can bring in concepts and ideas and forms from the past, such as like Cherokee language, like many indigenous languages, are so verb centric or so action centric. There are like it's like 80% nouns and 20%, 80% verbs and like 20% nouns, sorry, the other way around, such that any action is always in relation to other actions or other objects. So we're always using these noun verbs in indigenous languages, and that is something that talks about enactment, doing, living, just, I don't know, I think that one way of getting at this is by verbing the nouns. Like we need to be doing those things, and enlivening those concepts, and that to me is a way of practicing care or relationality, that is also about movement and orientation, because it's always in relationship to movement in space and time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is the bringing in the being and bringing in the body.
Yeah, relationship as a doing, not a kind of achievement, but as a doingness. And it's just funny because in Black English, if you will, or Ebonics, it was called briefly, or just Black talk, if you will. I mean, we're constantly making nouns into verbs. Zora Neale Hurston writes about, you better funeralize that, if you want to take something and kind of like put it over there where it belongs, which is not here. So yeah, this idea of concepts helping us imagine our making and understand our kind of being. I've been really compelled by this concept of weathering, and I'm sure you're both I'm sure you're familiar with it, but maybe we could talk a little bit about the weather, because the weather is bad and getting worse. I was talking to someone in New Orleans earlier today, and they missed this current hurricane. It went further to the, I think to the west than actually hitting the city this time, and that was today. We know California, and those are just two examples of sort of literal weather, if you will. But the weather has become a kind of trending theoretical scaffold to think about Black life, BIPOC life, and of course, queer life too. What is the weather and how do you navigate the weather? I mean, we know ancestors did. We know there was Ice Age, but what is the weather for you? And how are you weathering?
The weather, it's like a meditation when you imagine the sky and you just watch the weather change, and you just, the practice is to watch the sky and just watch it all pass without having a particular emotional attachment, or noticing your emotional attachment to the patterns, and understanding that that's just what it is. I mean, I feel like the weather recently is sullen, it's cloudy, it's moody, it's lonely, it's without, it's desiring, it's hungry, it's thirsty. The weather is just kind of like, it's not in the cute romantic way, it's this longing. I think there's just so much longing right now, and I'm really feeling it. I'm hearing it, I'm sensing it. People are longing for me, I'm longing for others. I'm longing for connection, you know, across borders. I'm longing for pleasure and something immediate too, like some immediate sense of connection as well, politically, historically, and maybe right now the weathering is, I've also been self-isolating for the past week, and I think after, you know, after all of the, you know, learning how to live with all of the precautions for the past 7-8 months, then, you know, going into a week or two of isolation really kind of, you're like, oh my God, this is like the really hard part of the meditation practice, where you're like, yeah, I know all the concepts and I know what I'm supposed to do. And then I have to practice it by myself for a week or two. We'll see. It's an endurance. It's an endurance practice, and learning how to maybe self-care, self-regulate, and somehow stay open and soft. I think that's my weathering. And I can't say that I'm doing it very well, but I think that's what I'm trying.
There's a beautiful book that is, it's called The Weather in Proust, that is a collection of essays by Eve Sedgwick. And, you know, it talks about Buddhism, it talks about affect, and it talks about how repair emerges sometimes through rupture. And I think that atmospherics is always about the link between rupturing and repairing. And I think that this is something that I mentioned Emily Johnson before, but I think that some of her work is really beautiful in that regard. And I think that we need to, well, not we need, I say we need, but like, I don't know what we need. I try to think about repair and rupture in the same breath, and I try to think about breath as being both the space of repair and rupture. I try to think about emergence as that type of space as well. There's a horizon in there as well, you know, where the things connect. I've been teaching a class about colonial literature, which has been a very interesting and trying exercise. So we've been reading Columbus and Vespucci and, you know, all these great guys. But the first thing we read was the Popol Vuh, which is the Maya story of creation. And the Popol Vuh starts with the horizon and the moment of stillness, which is also the moment of creation. And so I think that is quintessentially a space of rupture creation. And interestingly, and this brings it back to one of the previous strands of thought, when the world was created in the Popol Vuh, the gods have to first think, meditate before they act on that creation. So this is actually something that my students continually come back to, is that we need to think before we act. This same protocol is repeated in the creation of humans. Humans that are unable to think before they act are failed humans, and they have to be redone. So this is why humans are created 3 times in their Popol Vuh, because the first 2 times they weren't able to think before they acted. So, right? Like,
honestly, that explains it all. That's it right there. Like, oh, actually, we have to do this another time. Oh, let's do it another time. Oh, no, we didn't. That's why. That's why.
but like meditation then becomes a crucial act of creation.
Mm.
Meditation is the precursor to creation.
Mm.
That's what I take from that.
I was just thinking last night, I was lying in bed and talking to my lover on the phone, and I was thinking last night, like, what are all the beautiful things that we're going to, that are gonna appear and manifest after this year or 2 of really taking deep pause and reconsidering everything and reorienting our way of being and our daily lives and all these things, our relationships, and assuming that we are reorienting, right? Like assuming that we are actually taking pause and reconsidering and rethinking. And I had this kind of little, glimpse or taste of just beautiful things that I don't think I would have known would come. And I just kind of, it was like the first time this year that I was like, oh, that's going to happen. And I don't know what it's going to be. And I'm sort of curious about it. What's it going to look like? It's going to be really deep. It's going to be really majestic because my practices have been so humbling, I think.
Yeah. I'm thinking a little bit about the very sort of literal way to render Jose Munoz and queer possibility or ideality or horizon as being always out of reach. And that, in that rendering, we move towards queer because it's somewhere else, because this is shitty. This blows, the here and now is shitty. So the then and there is what we're trying to turn towards and move towards. But there's a kind of terrific critique. So we're never going to actually experience Black girl magic or joy or Black joy or queer kind of possibility, because it's always going to be somewhere else in some other time. But are we being greedy to think that I should get to have it, and too bad if other people do or don't? What do you make of this idea that a horizon or an action might always be somewhere else and some other time?
On a personal level, I'm learning that comes from a state of greed. That comes from the elsewhere is a kind of leaning. It's it's like a leaning forward or a still being tied up in the past in a sense of desiring that things were different, desiring that we had different things, that we were different, and actually not, perhaps in a way, not being in connection to, Joseph, the way the things you were talking about, this sort of connection on so many levels to one another, to human to non-human, and vice versa, because there is so much abundance always, and that thirst for something bigger, something better, something somewhere else, I think is maybe not taking in the full reality of what is right here, what is around you. And I think that also ties a little bit to kind of the historical erasure too, right? Like when I think about that, I think about gentrification, for example. These rich histories that are in a place being, raised, the space being raised to build the better thing, the brighter building. And those buildings, when we look around, those buildings are badly built and they're empty and they don't serve anyone, and they're sterile. And so that constant hunger for the elsewhere. And I have to check myself too, because I have a real like fantasy life where I'm like, ooh, if I had, over the past 10 years, if I hadn't been so invested in staying in New York, which is what I call home, and if I had, quit my job 10 years ago and traveled around the world like all these other artists, and my practice would be this and would be that, and so on and so forth. And that's all, that's fantasy. It's also a way of denying myself the pleasure of what I do have, the incredible richness of the connections and the history and the work that I've done, the communities that I have here. So maybe that's also a bit of a self-effacing, socialized stance, especially for folks who were socialized, not to be able to fully digest and enjoy what we do have, right? There's something a little bit self-effacing about that.
Yeah.
I think about the directions in Cherokee, in the Cherokee tradition, and in other traditions, where we have 7 directions. There are the 4 cardinal directions. There's above and below, and then there's the center, which is where you are now. And it's both a time and a place. So when I get ahead of myself too much, or when I get melancholic, and I'm wildly prone to melancholy, wildly, I can always remember that all I need to do is be where I am now. And that is a spiritual place to be. And that is a crucial element to the material reality of my life, but also the spiritual elements of my life. And it helps me be humble, and it helps me be grounded. That being said, I think that we lean and we gesture and we yearn. And that is an essential part of the queer futurity that we're creating and enacting. And I don't know that that necessarily means being egocentric or ego-driven, because in my reading of Munoz, that is always a collective desire, and that is something that brings world making and worlding into the picture in a way that, like, we're all just where we are now, but we're doing it together, and we're going there together, and we're yearning for it together. And that seems to me like the type of utopia that I can get behind. Like, I'm down for that.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, there's something more delicious when we're doing it together, right? Even watching the rainy skies together, it's just, I've been thinking so much about companionship and
Nice. Okay.
how important companionship is. And maybe that's the same thing that we've been talking about already. That collective desire, and that also that fantasy and aspiration is also, yeah, it creates a space where we actually are. So whether it's, you know, expressing and claiming, you know, our bodies, ourselves, our quote unquote identities and whatnot as queer and trans folks, suddenly making space that shatter all different other kinds of expectations on our bodies. And yeah, I'm hearing something about just the space making that happens when it is a collective act. So the difference between me yearning by myself and a kind of desirous yearning with others then all of a sudden creates like a little room where we can exist. That's what I'm hearing.
That's the commons, right? Like that's what when you commons.
Yeah.
Like the brown commons
Yeah.
is us yearning in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there something that's about a kind of like scale between commons and kin? I mean, because I'm kind of tilting towards how do we rise up as we need to in our practices of, you know, so we're surrounded by white supremacy and a certain kind of capitalist, you know, transactional exchange, and things are lots being put on our bodies constantly, ways to be, productivity models, when things need to happen. Like that's just, and even though we're in Rona and things shifted, I'm sure we've all experienced how they just keep coming back. You know, things are just like bouncing back at us. Like, okay, it's different, but you still have to do all this shit. You just have to do it. So then, you know, in our kinship and our commons, there's a way that I was thinking of commons as maybe being a question of scale, where the commons doesn't have to include our kin necessarily, but maybe you have other ways to think about it that could help us kind of address questions of rebellion. How do you make something that will help us reimagine in the kind of, it's not that we want to capitulate to the time that capitalism desires of us, but what do we do in response to that kind of incessant need for a certain kind of product and productivity? What are some of your methods in that?
That's the thirst. That is the settler colonial thirst. They're drunk and they need to stop. That's
yes. Settler colonial thirst.
And I could go on about that too. But you know, like I think that there's a caveat to the commons. I'm not like full on down for the commons in the sense that like commons that are not rooted in place, but rather are situated on top of indigenous land is not decolonial. It's just neo-colonial or like colonial light. And I'm not down for that. But collective reciprocal land backing care is something that I think frees all of us from the normative limitations of white supremacist heteropatriarchy. So, you know, yeah, period, I think.
Yeah, that's it. And to reaffirm all the things that we're saying, when all those things are true, then multiplicity, then so many of us are so many more of us get to be at the table. Then we get to then we get to repair together. You know, there's this kind of whatever, there's the word what is it? The word that like nonprofit folks use to talk about a sort of multiplicitous, you know, multiracial, multi-ethnic collaboration, collectivity, community, all of that. It's such a, it's escaping me, but it's such a like institutional word for what it's worth. Yeah, it's like, you know, this idea of oh yeah, okay, we, you know, we can like build these little bridges between us. That's not how it's going to work. It's not going to work that way. It's not going to, that little bridge is just, you know, it's a gesture. It's not a meaningful relationship. We're not really at the table together. Oftentimes we're maybe tokenized and representing, you know, a small fraction of maybe even a stereotypical understanding of what a whole community or diaspora might need in this moment. And then we're, you know, at this strange like UN type of sit down table, and that ends up, you know, not working. And here we are kind of staying relatively in the same place on some levels sometimes because we're not really interrelated, and we're not actually weaving together. We're just kind of representing some small facet of something that someone said that everybody thinks is important because, you know, a public speaker with a big profile on Twitter has decided that this is an important thing. And like sometimes I look at like sort of like current political left of progressive thought leadership in a lot of digital spaces. And I'm like, these are concepts from forever, and then also from Audre Lorde, and also from thinkers from, you know, not that long ago, but it's getting rebranded by like these thought leaders that have this kind of presence. And then I'm wondering also about, what does that mean about like our connection to our political thought ancestors? And like, what does it mean about, like, you know, do several generations kind of lose a political education, and we have to reformulate it with folks that are, you know, our age, like every single generation? I think the breakdown, I sense that there's this breakdown happening because of a lack of memory, and also a lack of being able to access previous generations in particular also, which might be kind of a queer phenomenon too.
This is why multiculturalism and inclusion and diversity is not liberation. You know, like the next time,
Yes, exactly.
on the diversity committee, like, come on now.
Yeah.
That's not it.
It's funny just because that, you know, diversity came and went. You know, I've been around a little bit, around the block a couple times at this point, and diversity did come through as like a trend, and then it went away, and then it came back. And, you know, I'm super cynical in general anyway, but I was just like really sad that this seemed to be a kind of like possibility for folks who wanted to work in academic institutions, but maybe less that, people who wanted to caretake in terms of a kind of physio-intellectual possibility. And I do think that in the best, you know, there's some teaching that happens or working in universities or you know, middle school or other kinds of educational address that is about a possibility of caretaking. That it's not always just about trying to be in front of the room or become a thought leader, although there's a lot of that, and I'm super not into it. But then diversity, like being a diversity officer, has become now, and maybe for a few more years, something that POC that we can do. And, you know, I'm really sad about that, but also want folks to be able to figure out how to sustain. So it's not like, I mean, it's a thing you can do, and it's a place you can work for maybe 8 or 10 years. It seems like that'll be possible. So I'm not sure what to do with that beyond the cynicism about it.
I think I'm really feeling for all of my friends and so who do so many kinds of work, who are being asked to play that role right now and change the museum single-handedly, you know, or change the academy single-handedly, or change the nonprofit industrial complex single-handedly. And I think the thing that we're all butting up against, it's not a huge revelation, but those models are still built on individual responsibility for one or a small group of people to caretake for an entire community with no resources, with no place, no space, and no resources. And so then we get put in dire positions. Yeah. And it's so cruel, honestly, it is so cruel to do that to BIPOC folks, considering our history, considering our understanding, considering our lived experiences, considering what we know and feel, you know, and we do feel, because we are also in an embodied way processing, so that white supremacy doesn't have to metabolize and fall down. So we process in our bodies, so that white supremacy can be, so that it can kind of go on in this as this sort of like form that doesn't have to. I'm really feeling for all of my friends who are doing all of this work and have been and will have to, and then it is still the individualized, individuated model of fixing a huge problem with and really not with no generosity from these spaces or institutions or what have you. It's just kind of a lack of understanding of what caretaking really means. Because I do think that if we made larger agreements as a society about what caretaking does entail, somehow I feel like actually the switch is not that hard, but it is an agreement. We have to make an agreement, and those agreements have to be pretty widespread. And so that's what I am wondering. Is it possible? Where does it happen? I know it is happening in many places. I want to know where those spaces are. I want to know how y'all are doing it, and I want us to talk regularly.
This is kind of like operating out of abundance rather than scarcity models, in which POC diversity work is constantly positioned within a scarcity model rather than one of abundance. And for example, I'm the diversity officer for our union, the faculty and staff union at Stony Brook. And so, you know, like, it's exhausting. And then, you know, you get brought in to talk about, I'm also the only Indigenous faculty member in the entire university, which is one of the larger state universities in New York. We have 20,000 students. And the percentage of Black faculty has actually decreased over the past 10 years. There are fewer Black faculty now than there were 10 years ago at Stony Brook. And at the same time, we're being asked to respond to Black Lives Matter. And so all of a sudden it's, oh, now we're gonna have a panel discussion about this and a panel discussion about that, with zero understanding of how the system needs changing, and that change requires resources, and it requires paying faculty and students and staff for that time and that labor. because we're constantly being asked to give the workshop about this or give the class about that, but nobody is getting remunerated for that time and that energy. And for the Zoom bombing that happened when we did that, you know, and people get called racial slurs.
Yeah.
You know, and like, so I'm disgruntled about diversity work right now, but I still do it because otherwise the institutions continue on without you. So I think that the word that I have in my mind about this is infiltration, rather than blind participation, or rather than acceptance or acquiescence. I would rather infiltrate and ruthlessly undermine than I would acquiesce to white supremacy. That's what I'm interested in.
Something about, I'm trying to line up, again, and I did this yesterday too, I can't believe it, but I'm not trying to just hit on orientation as if there's nothing else. I am wondering if there's a question of facing, because there is a way that diversity work, you know, recenters white supremacy or whiteness, or, you know, white ignorance, white fragility, you know, help me feel better about all the work you're doing, help me understand, explain it to me. So I guess a question that we can move towards our kind of allowing this assembly to turn into whatever else it wants to be, has to do with how do you face? And I think, you know, we've all together been saying it over and over again, but it's always worth revisiting, I think. If we're not going to face white supremacy, because, you know, who wants to do that? We're always involved in it anyway. Here's, you know, Foucault's model of power. It's always already there. It's unidirectional. Can't get out of it. We can't get out of the history that is built through these craftings of white supremacy. But as you've offered us again and again in our time tonight, we can lean and tilt and gesture and move and think carefully towards our abundance and our ancestors and our possibilities. What does that mean in terms of a facing? Where do you want to face? And what happens to the things that you aren't facing?
I sometimes think about, like, what are you giving it? What are you not giving it? Right? Like, we acknowledge violence, right? We acknowledge harm. We acknowledge, you know, coming from like a transformational justice kind of lens, we have to have the conversation, right, between the parties if you're a mediator or whatnot. We don't deny an act of violence or a system that perpetuates violence, but we also don't give it our everything necessarily, right? We don't let it, we try to figure out how to acknowledge the reality without letting it take our dignity, our spirit, our sustenance, ourselves. And we look for the sort of transformative possibilities, which also I think comes back to some kind of conversation, which maybe in and of itself is a bit limited, but kind of like humanizing, right? Like humanizing that violence happens through us, it happens to us, it happens between us and ourselves. And maybe I'm also thinking a bit back to this question of, like, you know, the way trauma manifests and actionizes, how we harm each other, how I don't know, harm is not something that is going to be out of the equation. So then it becomes a sort of transformative justice for me. conversation about understanding harm, the roots, the deep, deep, deep roots of it, and understanding that we have all been harmed. And so then can we transform our awareness to understand harm as sort of in the mix and also not something that we can actually work with rather than work around, and maybe, you know, seeing or knowing that so much harm happens from not acknowledging harm. Sometimes like a harm, you know, a harm reduction or like a transformative justice position is like, we have to look at the harm, and actually looking at the harm means looking at the history of harm, and doing a lot of caretaking work around that, because everybody is suffering from the histories of harm. Everybody is enacting harm, and we all have to kind of take responsibility and care. And that's really hard emotionally. That's really hard. And as a society, especially in a country that incarcerates more people within its borders than any other country in the world, looking at that harm, looking at the pain and the multiple generations of suffering that has caused, that causes, it's, you have to be pretty brave, I think, to want to face, to be willing to face that and to come in with a sense of care and responsibility. So yeah, folks who are doing that work like deserve all of our acknowledgement and props, because they're looking at things that nobody wants to look at. And, you know, no Americans really want to look at these histories of harm. And I say that, you know, the quote unquote American, but I'm really talking about this sort of nationhood of like, Americans don't want to face the harm that this country has caused to its own folks within its borders and then everywhere around the world.
When I was recently teaching about Columbus and the diaries that Columbus wrote, the first mention of people in the Indies or the Americas was that they saw naked people. That's the line. And there's also an orientation in that, who's doing the looking and who's being looked at. And this is an initial gesture of objectification and of capture, in which the colonial gaze hones in on a naked indigenous body. And that is the model of vision and of power that has been perpetuated ever since then. So how we look, how we orient ourselves in many ways has been conditioned from that initial interpolation. So I'm constantly trying to find ways of alternative gesturings and leanings. And sometimes it's so, the weight of it all is so much that it's hard to turn, it's hard to reorient. But if we can think of the other side of that gaze on the shore, then we can shift the perspective and we can start to imagine otherwise. And so for me, this is where thinking with our stories, thinking with our understandings of kinship, reorients us from our own epistemological framework and cosmological framework, rather than the one that has been imposed for 500 years. And because the stories that we have are much older than 500 years, and they have the wisdom of generations and generations of ancestors. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Generations and generations, time. Repair is something I want to really dream about tonight, because it wasn't something I had thought of in relationship to, I don't know, this time. And I'm really appreciative of that concept among so many others. Care, we kind of really sat with for an awful lot of our conversation, caregiving. Someone in the chat was asking a question about bottoming, if you will. You know, what is it to be concerned with the posterior or the background? And I know we could spin that open in many directions for hours and hours and hours, if not lifetimes. And maybe that's our challenge and task, is to do that in practice and to keep sort of aware of the work that there is. The last thing I heard you both say to me in a certain kind of way was this labor is ongoing and it's difficult. And you've also helped remind me that, you know, we have strategies and we have tactics and we have ways to keep engaging this work if we can keep figuring out how to connect through care and a careful kind of rendering of our shared possibilities. Jared's going to come in to have a thing or two to say before we'll do our closing ritual, if you will.
Oof. Thank you. That was amazing again. Really, I don't have much to say other than I just wanted to thank everybody, especially the panelists and especially our ASL team who are so phenomenal. And also to remind people that it's happening again tomorrow, but it's going to be at a slightly different time to try to accommodate Joy Mariama Smith, who is coming to us from Amsterdam, I believe. And it's Joy and jumatau. And,
yes.
And so it's going to just be another beautiful, beautiful time. So join us for that if you can. And these will all be recorded and hosted both on the Lions Jaw website and probably eventually at MIT as well. So that's it for me.
So we thank Tricia and Hercules, they're amazing. We thank, you know, each other for finding our way together. And, you know, if you want to unmute and give a shout out in sound, if you like, to the folks, the panelists, and just thank you so much. Joseph, thank you. Marbles, I see you. Marbles, yes.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Love y'all.
Okay.
Much appreciation. Bye.
So beautiful.
Thank you.
Watch the stars blink out.
Yes.
See you lovely folks tomorrow.
Yes, thank you so much.